Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Stephen Gay, Interim Associate Dean of Medical Student Education for the University of Michigan Medical School. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our session, Health Equity, Advocacy, and Social Justice, on campus and beyond, the first of a number of community conversations concerning the complex societal issues that impact our role as individuals who deliver health care and create the challenges concerning the delivery of that health care and the development of policy that will impact our efforts to serve all that we come in contact with. Many here are already strongly engaged in advocacy. The challenge recently has been the ability to advocate for our beliefs in a clear and fair way without judgment being made on the person we are. Throughout this pandemic, communication and understanding has become increasingly strained as we struggle under greater pressures to serve and face greater challenges from those that think and believe different from ourselves. We have been asked upon occasion to be a blank slate, to be open and engage despite our personal beliefs and opinions, but that is difficult when a free exchange of thoughts and ideas feels challenged. As an academic institution, we remain committed to the open and fair engagement of all thoughts and ideas. In so many ways, we must be, in order to protect our own thoughts and ideas. This is a critical part of our professional practices that we must navigate. It is important that we find ways to channel our frustrations, passions, and feelings into avenues that can create changes we want to see and allow us to grow. This session will provide some of the perspectives from professionals in varying fields to describe how that advocacy can present itself in an academic medical center and in our university community. With that, it is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this session, Kristen Howard, Senior Director of the Office of Health, Equity, and Inclusion for Michigan Medicine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gay. I'm really excited to join with you all in this conversation today. And I want to start by just giving a brief reminder with our general subject matter. We had a lot of pre-questions just about current status of law and policy, and there was really an excellent session on our Well-Aware site for Michigan Medicine. So if you have a question about the status of law and policy around reproductive justice right now, and that was your question that you asked, that is on our Well-Aware site. We're going to talk with our panel today specifically about how advocacy shows up in this space, as Dr. Gay shared. And then in our final session, we will circle back post-election to reproductive justice. So I'll start by introducing our panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Lou Edge. Dr. Edge is a board-certified family physician. She was the Ohio Academy of Family Physicians 2012 Physician of the Year, as well as receiving the 2022 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Humanitarian Award. She started at Michigan State University at age 16, where she received a Bachelor of Science degree in physiology. She was president of her medical school student body at the University of Michigan. Go Blue. She completed her family medicine training with honors, where she served as she completed her family medicine training with honors, where she served as program director for 7 years. She was the youngest chief of staff in the 100-year history of St. Luke's Hospital and the first female chair of her department. Dr. Edge has a master's in health professions education from the University of Michigan, and she is currently the Associate Dean of Graduate Medical Education at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center. Her interests include health professions education and health policy. Up next, we have Justin Hodge, who is a clinical assistant professor of social work at the University of Michigan. He is the co-lead for the Policy and Political Social Work Pathway and the director of the Online Certificate in Political Social Work. Hodge is committed to increasing the presence of social workers in policy and political spaces. He teaches courses that provide students with the tools to engage in politics and approach policy work from a social justice perspective. Hodge was elected to the Washtenaw County Board of Commissioners in November 2020. As a county commissioner, he brings a social work perspective to addressing the most pressing problems facing Washtenaw County. Hodge has a particular focus on addressing inequities in the county and promoting economic opportunity. In 2021, Hodge was appointed by the governor to the Commission on Community Action and Economic Opportunity, where he is able to lend his expertise at the state level. Nationally, Hodge serves as the board president of the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy, which works to expand the participation of social workers in federal legislative and policy processes. Hodge is dedicated to mental health and public health on both a policy and individual level. He's provided therapy to children and families, case management to individuals with developmental disabilities, and has coordinated clinics for children in crisis. By leveraging his experiences as both a clinical and macro social work practitioner, Hodge aims to bridge the gap between the two for students. He feels strongly that all social workers should be involved in our democracy and works individually with students to help them find how their desired career can align with that. And finally, we have Maya Kabersi. Her primary practice areas as an attorney include affirmative action and diversity, election law, privacy, research and research misconduct, university logo issues, and in-state tuition guidelines for students. Maya is the Office of the General Counsel Liaison to the Institutional Review Board, Health Sciences and Behavioral Science. She also serves on a number of university committees and is an active member of the National Association of College and University Attorneys. She is presented at the university, state, and national level at conferences on issues relating to diversity, human subjects research, and election law. Title IX, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, and employment compensation, among other topics. Prior to joining the Office of the Vice President and General Counsel, Maya worked in the education group of Hogan and Hartson, now Hogan Lovells, where she advised clients on numerous K-12 higher education and civil rights issues. She received her BA from the University of Michigan, go blue, I caught it this time, and her JD from Harvard Law School, where she was executive editor of the Harvard Law Review and a finalist and oralist in the Ames Moot Court competition. In recognition of her work to help ensure that Americans with limited English proficiency have meaningful access to federal and federally funded programs, Maya received the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund's Excellence in Legal Profession Award in 2002, and the National Asian Pacific American Legal Consortium's Distinguished Service Award in 2003. And so with those distinguished panelists, we are ready to get started and get into the meat of our discussion. So I will start with just having an opportunity for each of our panelists to kind of introduce themselves and speak a little bit about the lens they bring to advocacy in healthcare and or in diversity, equity, and inclusion more broadly. And so we'll start with you, Dr. Ajay.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to say thank you to the 388 of you who are joining us today in the room and also on live stream. This is an important discussion, and I'm glad that you're here. I'm honored to have been invited. First of all, I wanted to go ahead and talk about the tripod upon which my advocacy stands, and then talk about, very briefly, my personal perspective and my professional perspective. So the tripod, first of all, the first piece is the definition of physician advocacy. And I'm going to read it so I do it complete justice. This is the definition that Mark Ernest published in Academic Medicine in 2010. Physician advocacy is action taken by physicians to promote social, economic, educational, and political changes that ameliorate suffering and threats to human health and well-being that they identify through their professional work and expertise. I love that quote because what is more noble than to ameliorate suffering and threats to human health and well-being? The second of the tripod pieces for me is a quote by Thomas Jefferson, and that is that on matters of style swim with the tide, on matters of principle stand like a rock. And so determining what your rocks are and the things that you will not budge on is an extremely important and personal journey. And the very last one is a graph that was published in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2009. And it shows that if you spend at least 20% of your time doing meaningful work that's meaningful to you, that it mitigates burnout. So my advocacy, which I've been doing for 27 years since I was here at this medical school, has really prevented me from having burnout. So onto the professional and the personal lens. I am a Black woman sitting before you, but and you can make all sorts of assumptions with that. But I was born in Iowa, and I lived 14 years in a previously British colony in South Central Africa. So when I say God save the Queen, that may be controversial in certain situations, but for me, it was the reason I speak English, and I'm grateful. Additionally, my father is Nigerian, so African, and my mother is a Black American. So I bring that lens to the table. Additionally, professionally, I have several different layers. One, I'm at the institution level, I advocate for our 709 residents and fellows. I also have an institutional project, which is to coalesce all the advocacy silos that our learners are working on. And at the national level, I go ahead and do family medicine residency education with the ACGME. So I help write the regulations for family medicine education. I'm also on the Council of Medical Education for the AMA. That's a little bit about my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to join our panelists for more of a discussion. So I'm going to join you all here and ask that Professor Hodge, that you go ahead and give the same question and provide your perspective here.
All right, well, thank you. And first I gotta say it's great to be home back in Michigan Medicine. I used to work in the Rachel Upjohn building in child and adolescent psychiatry, so really happy to be back. I had to put one of my Michigan Medicine lapel pins on for the event today. So a lot of my perspective is informed by my practice work as a social worker. So in the bio you heard a bit about how I used to do child and family therapy, ranging from doing home-based, where I'd meet kids and families at their homes, McDonald's, library, school, wherever, and then eventually moved into doing crisis intervention work, primarily with suicidal teens. What really got me to start to engage in politics was my experience as a clinical social worker working for a community mental health system. So I pursued a career in social work because I was focused on wanting to promote social justice. And after I graduated, I still wanted to really figure out what did that look like for me. And I started to figure that out as I was practicing, and it was during the time when the state legislature dramatically cut the budgets to the CMH system. And that put me in the position of being one of the social workers on the ground that had to discharge a lot of clients, many of which without a good transition plan. And from there, I started to look at who tends to be the people in positions of power that make these hugely consequential decisions about people's lives. And they tend not to be social workers or people with a social justice focus, and that wasn't the case in Michigan at that time either. So from there, I started looking at other ways for me to get involved and to bring my perspective as a clinical social worker, and then as a person just thinking about how do we make our society better. For me, that looked like getting appointed to various local boards and commissions, which is a thing that I teach my students about now, and as a great way to really get involved. And as I found myself in different spaces, I served on a local civil rights commission for a while, another one that was responsible for allocating federal funds to human service agencies. I was always the only social worker there, and it tends to be dominated by lawyers and business people. So then I started thinking about how do we get more people with a mindset for promoting social justice and equity in those spaces. And I thought back to my time in my MSW program, which wasn't strongly focused on policy and not at all about politics. And I started thinking about how can we change social work education? And for me, that looked like writing up a bunch of different ideas for what that could look like, doing a lot of research, and having conversations with a lot of my former professors. Long story short, I ended up at Michigan Medicine and at the Rachel Upjohn building, and then teaching at the School of Social Work as an adjunct in policy courses. That went really well, and then ultimately I was lucky enough to be able to get the position I have now where I'm teaching students full time. And as part of what I do is I was able to help us shift our curriculum to having the equivalent of what our majors are called pathways. And I'm the faculty co-lead for what's the new policy and political social work pathway. Outside of that work and trying to be able to provide students with opportunities in the classroom to figure out how they can see themselves as an advocate and to engage in advocacy and the issues important to them, I decided to run for office in 2018 in Washtenaw County. I didn't win that time, but you got to stay at it. It's hard to run against an incumbent, and we didn't do terribly. So I knew I would run again in 2020. It was the height of the pandemic. Actually, the pandemic had everybody started to learn what COVID was right at the beginning of the campaign. So that put us in a position to figure out how do you campaign during a pandemic when you can't do that door-to-door interaction with voters, which is the most important thing in a campaign. Ultimately, we were successful running for re-election this year and already won my primary, which is the big thing for my race. And being on the board, I've really focused on how do we promote equity, how do we use tools available to the county and mandate that we use tools like our Opportunity Index to make sure that we're focusing resources in the areas that need it most. I think for a lot of the problems that we're looking at, the research and strategies exist. It's just a matter of making sure that our elected officials have the will to put the resources in the right place. So really happy to be here and happy to have the discussion we're about to have.
Thank you. And of course, Maya.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially to be with such esteemed panelists and a moderator. So when I first was thinking about this, I was really thinking about my role at the university, but after hearing the remarks from my fellow panelists, I thought I might go back a little bit further, but I promise I won't take too much more time, to just think about why I do the kind of law that I do in the first place, right? So no one in my family was an attorney. I didn't really know anyone who was an attorney. My parents, especially my mother, was convinced I was going to be an attorney because I talk so much and I really liked to prove my points, you know. So even when I was 8 years old, I was kind of confident that that's what I was going to do, but I didn't really know what that meant or what that would look like, right? And when you think about an attorney and you see them on TV or in a movie, they're always in the courtroom and they're expounding on, you know, various points, but I wasn't sure that that was really what I wanted to do either. Part of that relates to my type A personality. I don't know that I can rely on other people to give the evidence in a trial. I want to be the one talking and saying what's happening. So maybe appellate law would have been an option, hence the moot court. But in any event, when I was in law school, I was very interested in topics that related to constitutional law or that related to social justice issues, because I really wanted to think about how I could use my degree to make the world a better place, you know, even in some small way, right? So it was never interesting to me to think, and no offense to people who want to do this, but for me it was never interesting to think about practicing corporate law and figuring out how to get more money to a corporation or how to protect, you know, more assets of an insurance company or something so they didn't have to pay out on their policies. I was trying to think, what can I do to make things better? And so when I was in law school, we had firm interview week, right? The firms would come to interview with us, and I looked at the firms to see which of them had strong pro bono public interest units. I didn't want to go to a firm that didn't show some kind of evidence of their commitment to the community and to sort of the same ethos of making things better. So I rolled out a lot of firms that people told me were really good firms, but they didn't have what I was looking for. And so when I interviewed at Hogan and Hartson, which was what it was called then, they had an entire community service department, and you could actually not just do one-off projects, but you could actually be assigned to that as your full-time job to be in the community service department. But what they also had, which interested me just as much and ultimately more, was an education group. Most law firms don't, or especially at that time, didn't really have an education group, but Hogan had one that focused not only on higher ed law, but also K through 12. So they were handling desegregation lawsuits, they were bringing school finance lawsuits to try to improve the equity of resource distribution at our public schools. They were working on diversity and affirmative action work at the higher ed level, and, you know, among other things. And I really, really, really wanted to be a part of that group. And so I was able to rotate into the group and then to stay with the group. And I was at Hogan for over 5 years in the in the education group, working on both K through 12 and higher education work. And I only left the firm because of an opportunity here at U of M, my alma mater. Yes, go blue, that actually focused on diversity and affirmative action work as well. So the posting that was issued for U of M was specifically for diversity and affirmative action. And I thought, this is what I've been working on, this is what I'm committed to, and I would really love the opportunity to help my alma mater, go blue, do the work that it was eager to do. Now, this was after the Supreme Court cases back in 2003, so I didn't come back to the university until 2005. But I came back just in time for a ballot initiative that was initially proposed in 2003, weeks after the Supreme Court decisions, that intended to undo those decisions. So I'm talking about the Grutter and Gratz cases, which were the cases where the University of Michigan was defending its consideration of race in the selection of students to pursue the educational benefits of a diverse educational student body. As soon as I got here, that was one of the issues that the university was facing. And so they said, look, you're already working on diversity and affirmative action issues. There's now going to be an election that's going to focus on diversity and affirmative action issues. You should also be the election law attorney here at the university. And so I didn't know what that meant. I'd never done anything on election law. But I quickly learned that as a public institution in the state of Michigan, the university is subject to the Michigan Campaign Finance Act, which includes a provision that says that the university, it's not specifically just limited to the universities, it's public bodies, and people acting on behalf of public bodies can't use public resources to support or oppose candidates or ballot questions. And so my work quickly became sort of figuring out what kinds of things could we do, what kinds of things could we not do with university resources to help educate people about this ballot initiative, Prop 2, which did wind up passing. I'm not going to say any more now. I'll save it for later in the discussion. But just to say that my work has always sort of had this component of DEI to it. And I just want to note, I did say that the ballot question was adopted back in 2006. And I just want to be clear that there were then questions like, what does that mean? The ballot proposal says that the university, and it did specifically name the university, were the first entity listed in the ballot proposal. It says the University of Michigan, Michigan State University, and Wayne State University shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any person or group on the basis of race, sex, ethnicity, color, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting. And so when it passed, a lot of people said, well, okay, so that's it now. The university can't do anything. And I'm sure you've seen that that's absolutely not the case, right? We certainly are just as committed as we ever have been. We just have different parameters that apply to us and different approaches that we have to take in light of that. And so the university has been engaging in this diversity strategic planning effort, the DEI strategic planning effort, which is being renewed for a 2.0. And I am deeply involved in the university's efforts in that regard. And I also serve as the DEI lead for my own unit of OGC. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. And, in a student-facing panel, I'd be remiss if I didn't note how each of your careers has grown and how your advocacy shifts over time as you encounter different situations, different opportunities. Suddenly you're an election lawyer, you're running for office and doing it more than once. You've been advocating for a long journey and finding how that also is influencing your day-to-day work. And so I'd like to ask, what are some of the differences that you have seen in translating your experiences in the classroom when you're training in social work and medicine and law, and at the university level, which can be heavily focused on conversation and theory and research, to practical solutions around advocacy, policy, and law? And I'll start with you, Professor Hodge.
All right, thank you. One thing I say to my classes frequently, kind of a joke, but also true, is that Professor Hodge is nonpartisan, Commissioner Hodge is. So when I am teaching in the classroom, I keep it nonpartisan, and I don't really want to focus too much on theory. They get enough of that in the other classes, but I have to do it to some extent. I try to keep my courses as practice-focused as possible. I design my assignments in ways where students are actively in the community engaging with policymakers, community stakeholders, to design an assignment that is helpful for them. To give you an example, the class I just taught this morning is my policy analysis course, and what we focus on in that class is getting students to find a policy issue that affects something that either their community or their field placement or something that's important to them, and then find someone in the community to connect with. It might be a state legislator, it might be someone else, and say, hey, I'm really interested in this issue. What can I do to be helpful to whatever it is you're doing to further it? And then I design the assignment in a way where students can have the flexibility to make that a thing that's useful for whoever they're working with. And I really frame it as, you're not doing any of the assignments in this class for me. I'm gonna give you feedback and grade it, because that's my job, but it's designed in a way for you to find practical use for your personal growth and for community use when you're engaging people, stakeholders in the community. So that's really the perspective I try to bring, because so much of what I bring to the classroom is my own practice experience, and I want, in social work being a practice-focused field, is what I want to try to bring and encourage more people to be in advocacy in that way.
Thank you. Dr. Liu? Mm-hmm.
So my clinical learning environment really is the hospital and the outlying clinics. And so one of the things that we are doing at University of Cincinnati is actually setting up an advocacy training program. And that is a program whereby there are 3 different pieces. Number one, we have a curriculum where our learners are able to go ahead and build skills that will help them to do persuasive writing, to a legislator, et cetera. Secondly, that they are able to do issue-based participation, both with a legislator or in their community. And thirdly, they would have an institutional project. So again, what we're trying to do is actually take some of the silos of activism that are already sort of spotted around our institution and coalesce them into a single program. My job as an educator really is to make sure that we have protected time for them to do that. Nobody has any extra time in a curriculum, but for those folks who are interested in having skills like, with the Flint water crisis, that physician was amazing, and she had skills that she could amplify the voice for kids who were being poisoned by lead in the water. So I want to make sure that all of my residents leave with skills that if they find something in their clinical practice, they are able to activate, help, and amplify their voice.
And I do just want to ask a follow-up question. That is fascinating. And so that is operating for graduate medical education, so for residents. Okay. And Maya?
So I don't have as much wonderful things to say as my fellow panelists, but I guess for me, my role really is to help people understand that just because there may be limitations, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, right? So I think what I worry about a lot with my job is that there will be some people who will think, geez, the lawyers are going to tell me no, so I'm just going to do anything I want and hope they don't catch me, right? Hope no one finds out. I don't love that, because that puts the institution at risk in a way that we don't necessarily need to be. But I also I worry a lot about the people, and I don't really like the idea that there are people out there who think, oh, we probably can't do this. I'm not even going to try to do anything. Like the people who thought, well, Prop 2 passed, we can't care about diversity anymore. Or this is the end of, there's an election limitation on us in terms of what kinds of resources we can use. I'm not going to put on a program that talks about anything that might be politically charged in any way, because then I run the risk of, violating that law. We really, really, really want people to work within those parameters, right? To find that middle ground in that spectrum, to say, this is what I'm trying to accomplish. How can I go about accomplishing it, or accomplishing something as close to it as possible that would still keep the university in a good position? And another thing that I try to do sometimes is, sometimes someone will come to me, I'm not going to name any names of anyone in this room, right? But sometimes someone will come to me and they might have an idea that we haven't done before, that we haven't said is consistent with what we've interpreted the law to be. But maybe it could be. And so I really want people to see that part of my job is to think, is there a way to make this argument that this is actually permissible, that this actually does flow, that the university can engage in this way? And then, if there is such an argument, to try to convince those that actually make the decisions at the institution that they should go with that argument and try to move forward in that way.
And I'll ask a follow-up here. Does that often happen quickly? When you are navigating an issue like that, is that a quick process, or how long might it take to kind of determine when you're trying to figure it out? What has the journey been like for you? Was it all done the first year, or how does that continue to show up?
No, it's always changing, right? Because people will come up with new ideas. There will be new people in roles. And so, someone will say, well, that might be how it was done before, but I'm coming in with this perspective. What can we do here? The one thing that's tricky, I'll just say about the Prop 2 aspect, is that there isn't really case law that I can look to. Lawyers like to look at precedent. We like to see what has been done before and what happened when that was done. But with something that is like this Proposal 2 that passed in 2006, there really aren't any cases, I'm going to knock wood, in Michigan about it. And unfortunately, there were only 2 states that had passed similar proposals before us, and their experiences were very different. So if you looked at one state as an example, we wouldn't be able to do almost anything, right? And if you looked at the other state as an example, we could try to do a lot of stuff and we would probably get sued and it might not work out the way we wanted it to. So it always takes time, and you always sort of have to build those relationships too, I think, so that people do feel comfortable coming and talking with you. And it's important too to better understand the work, right? Like if someone comes to me and asks me a question and I have no idea how they do their job, it's really hard for me to figure out, if they can't do it exactly as they want to do it, what other options might there be for them? So I think it's really important to build those relationships and to engage in those discussions to try to understand how we can move forward.
Thinking about the timing of all of this, how do we deal with generational divides and the frustration at the pace of progress that we might see? Dr. Ejie, you mentioned you've been doing this work for 28 years, and so if you'd like to take that one first.
Absolutely. I found myself sort of being embedded in graduate medical education for a couple of different reasons. Number one, I think it's an incredible privilege to be able to help our learners graduate into the best health for their career growth, and so providing them the skills they need to just really have a healthy career. I'm on Twitter, and one of my most retweeted tweets, I'm going to read it to you, I posted that if you are over 45 and do not have a mentor under 30, not a mentee, a mentor under 30, then you're going to miss fundamental shifts in thinking that are happening. And I have 806 likes on that and the same number of retweets. The issue here is that, number one, working with Steve Gay on the admissions executive committee prior to my current role, for doing that for years, I was able to see a ton of fantastic, rich backgrounds of our medical students coming in with MBAs. I don't have an MBA, I have an MHPE. Totally different perspective, a different skill set, et cetera. So there are so many things that we can learn from folks who are younger than us. Number two, back to the quote from Jefferson, on matters of style, swim with the tide, on matters of principle, stand like a rock. If somebody who is a learner comes to me with a request that we do X, Y, or Z, and it is the right thing to do, then my job is to understand the rules within which they can do what they want to try and get them to yes, to try to work with them. And so I'll give two examples. We had a brilliant resident around the time of the last midterms who actually had a smart phrase that they developed to put into Epic to help patients register to vote. And I'm like, yikes! No, I know what you're trying to do. We can't do that. It cannot be in the medical record, but what we can do is Operation Vote, which is a sheet of paper that will go with the patient. It has QR codes for voting in Kentucky, Ohio, and Michigan, and this is how you can register. You are not able to make specific, political comments, et cetera, et cetera. You're not able to take time from the patient's visit, but I know what you want to do. Let me help you get to yes. Now, if on the matter of principle they are wrong and that's something we don't want to do, whatever it is they bring up, then I go down the other pathway, and that is, there's a great article in Forbes, May of 2013, How Great Leaders Deliver Bad News. And I go through that process knowing, number one, that I have to listen. I've recruited brilliant people into my institution. If they have a problem with what I'm saying, I have to respect and hear what they're saying. In addition to that, go ahead and have a plan moving forward and telling them exactly how us not doing this will affect them or their environment. And so just trying to determine for that cause which way to go. So,
Would anyone else like to share thoughts? Mm-hmm.
Well, I just want to echo that idea. I mean, I think the point of trying to get them where they want to be, to the extent that we can, is something that I also bring to my work. I think OGC in general, despite the reputation attorneys have, we really do try to cultivate that idea that we are going to get you where you want to be, or as close to it as we possibly can get you. But I agree, too, that there are times when we do have to say there really isn't an argument here, right? And it's difficult sometimes to know where that distinction is, but I think it's really important for us to recognize that there is a distinction and to think more, and I will say this is where I think we could do more as an institution, to think more about better explaining why there is a distinction. So I'm just to give you one example, pretty much every group of students that comes in is dismayed that we don't have more demographic diversity, right? And particularly right now with African American students, our enrollment is very low, and it doesn't make any difference to a student to say, oh, but you don't know there's this law that makes it really tough and we're not allowed to do this, right? Because the student doesn't care. They're seeing, but I need to have, you've said that there are educational benefits. You're basically telling me I'm not getting what you've promised me. How can how can this be? And not only do the students want, and sometimes even faculty and staff, not only do they want to see that greater diversity, but they want it to be quantifiable, right? They're very worried that we will coast if we aren't sort of held to the fire. That if we say something like, oh, we'll try to increase it, that we would say, okay, well, it went from 4% to 4.1, yay, victory, problem solved, right? So but at the same time, from a legal perspective, we absolutely cannot say, according to the Supreme Court, we cannot say we are going to get to this percent representation of African American students or Latinx students or any other group by race or ethnicity. The only thing the court will let us say is increase. We've changed it to increase year over year, and the court won't let us set an end goal. The only end goal we can set is critical mass. And if you try to define critical mass, you are lost. So, because the second you do, the court says, aha, it was a number all along, that's a quota, you're not allowed to do that. And that's actually what happened in the various Supreme Court arguments, where they kept trying to get the U of M Law School, the attorney representing us in the U of M Law School case to say, what is a critical mass? Like, is it 14%? It seems like it might be 14%. And we could not say it was, because then they would say, you're out of line, that's unconstitutional. So the challenge, I think, is to sort of make that point, but to not let that be the end of the conversation, right? If we're saying we can't do that, and then we end it, it looks like we're saying we don't care, we're not listening, we're not trying to see what else we could do. And so the issue is to try to come up with alternatives or other ways or other things that we maybe haven't thought of. And I will confess, we haven't been super successful, right, in making the progress that we would like to make, but we have to be ready to keep having that conversation and to keep trying new approaches until we find something that works.
Thank you.
I would just add that the question makes me think about the importance of history and making sure that you're in interdisciplinary and intergenerational spaces. I think about what we try to do at the county, where we bring in diverse perspectives, is through our board and commission process, where we have residents that are essentially working with the government to advise the elected officials and county departments on what we do. And to give you a couple of examples, we have a youth commission and a commission on aging, and both of those I think are fairly unique, particularly the youth commission. And what that looks like is it's largely high school students that are getting involved in county government and can share perspectives on what are issues that we're facing, that they're facing, and that the county is facing, and give us that youth perspective that the elected officials just don't have. Similarly, when we're thinking about how do we make sure that we're creating an environment that is helpful and works for everyone of all ages, our Commission on Aging has been instrumental in getting us to think about how do we increase senior services, where do we find the funding to do that, what is effective, what have other places done, and what has failed in the past, that history piece. There's so much that we can learn from history, and that's the piece about why we need to be in intergenerational spaces. I think that's just really critical.
And I am going to ask a sudden follow-up. So you mentioned that when you were running for office the first time, it didn't work out. How did you kind of find the perseverance to come back? Because I think when we talk about frustration at the pace of progress, sometimes it's not the first time, and it's not the first way that you come at an issue. And so I'm interested to hear your perspective on kind of choosing to run again and try again.
Well, okay, it's a good question. So one thing that helped is we didn't lose by a ton. We got like 37.5%, who's counting? But we were, and we were also going up against an incumbent that had been around for a really long time. So we knew the odds were against us to begin with, but ultimately what it was about was the issues that I was passionate about and wanted to make a change on were not going to change because the same person was going to still be in office. So yeah, I was very disappointed for months. And you just have to figure out how do you pick yourself back up, stay passionate. You talked about burnout earlier. I was burned out for a little while after that because there's nothing like running a campaign. I mean, it's when it ends, it's great. When it ends in a success, it's great. When it's over too, and then you get your rest, you get back at it, the issues you're passionate about are still there. So that's what got me back in it. Yeah, I think I took a little bit of a break and thought, okay, let's start planning for 2020.
I appreciate that. You got to stick with it. So another question, as you're asked to share your viewpoint and advocate for various topics, how do you meld, balance, in some cases maybe turn off, personal beliefs when you're representing an institution to engage in advocacy? And so I'll start back with you, Maya, on that question.
So one thing that's really helpful to me in my role is that it's very defined that the general counsel's office are not the decision makers, right? We are not the decision makers. So it's easy to turn off my beliefs in some ways, but my beliefs are always partially there, right? There's no way that I would not be thinking about, how something might appear or sort of looking past just the specific question that's asked to think about the bigger policy implications, right? Because that happens a lot. Someone comes and they're like, I just want to know the answer to this. And you say, but that's not the real issue. The real issue is all of the stuff that's around this. And so, you do have to have in my role, you do have to have that ability to sort of take a step back and think about what the bigger issues are. But in the end, I can only present the information that I have, but I can't sort of force the decision to be consistent with what I personally believe, right? And it's not that it's come up so much, and that's one of the pleasures of working at the University of Michigan and having sort of a lot of the same general views and general perspectives on issues like DEI. But there are times that I might wish that we would do something more. I might have come up with an argument that I think maybe could work. Let's try it, but no one else wants to try it. There's one that I've been pushing. I've gotten some individual units to do it, but I can't sort of get a university-wide position on it. I don't know if it will make a huge difference, but I also know that if we don't try, we'll never know if it would make a huge difference. So I don't know, I guess I'm gone on long enough, but it's sort of that for me, the issue is having that lens, but letting my professional role sort of take priority.
Oh, I appreciate that. And I think, Dr. Ade?
So one of the things that I think was really prominent for me this pandemic was getting involved in the Moderna trial. This is Moderna trial day 747. And I got enrolled in it back in August of 2020 when we had a sudden death of my stepmother. She succumbed over 8 days. She was previously very healthy. Prior to the EUA from Moderna, in December, we had 3 additional deaths in my family. So it catapulted me into the trial because University of Cincinnati was one of the 90 trial sites, and I just enrolled for a couple of reasons. One, I felt that I could stand as a credible advocate for Black and brown people who were disproportionately affected, advocating for vaccine safety. And what ended up happening was the American Medical Association, one of the staff writers, Sarah Berg, wrote an article and tweeted it, and then it got picked up by MSNBC, and I had 100 or so media interactions on Fox and BET and TMZ Live and all this other stuff, trying to get the message out, and not just once, multiple times in the same arenas, because these discussions happen over time. So as far as representing my institution, first of all, making disclaimers is important. They were there for a reason. Number 2, to go ahead and make sure that your leadership is aware and they've given blessing for you to go forward with talking points and things like that. I also think it's very important that there is clear alignment with actions and words, that what we're doing reflects what we're saying. And in that space, that was very important for me. It got a little sticky when vaccines became politicized, and I had to navigate those arenas. As a physician, a family doc, it was difficult when a pastor walked in and said that God was protecting him, and he's not going to get vaccinated. Or somebody who had a completely different political affiliation came in and they were wearing the colors or the logos, et cetera. But my job as a physician is really to focus on the evidence and the best I can translate those stories with appropriate analogies so that my patients can make decisions that are appropriate for them and their families.
I think this has really changed for me over time as I've had different roles, because when I think back to my work as a clinical social worker, I much more aligned with your final examples there around clear role. A lot of what I would probably think about in my free time politically, or if there's a policy issue coming up, is not really going to be relevant for those kinds of conversations. That's changed, one, because I'm in politics, but the other piece about being at the school, I always say this in my class, is that social work tends to be the kind of field that draws people in because of our code of ethics and the values associated with the field. That's not always the case, and it's not like you go into the school of social work, everybody agrees. That's not the case. But in a broader sense, people are interested in advocacy and in promoting social justice, and something that we've seen increase over time, particularly as throughout the pandemic and as world events continue to be challenging, students would look to the school to make public statements about things, which originally the school wasn't really prepared to do that because it's not a thing that they would think, administration would think they would have to do, but students were looking for that, to know that the school that is teaching people to be advocates largely cares about these issues and is willing to make statements. And sometimes I would consult with, well, here's how we might want to frame going about saying this. But I think the key, like, to really answer your question directly, it's the disclaimers. Like, really put the disclaimer out there, like, I'm not speaking on behalf of the University of Michigan. I'd be real careful about that for all the reasons that Maya's mentioned. And when I talk about things at the county level, we're really careful to say that, because there are 9 county commissioners. We each represent a different part of Washtenaw County. No one of us speaks for the whole county. So when I have to be clear, I say that. So it's really clear I'm speaking as myself, and I'd be clear about that when I have to be. But in other cases, it's it's sometimes working to help shape the messaging for what the organization might do. I think I've been in a position to do that a couple of times.
So Dr. Ejay and Professor Hodges' remarks made me think of 2 other things, one about sort of more about the political aspects of it specifically. So again, because part of my role at the university relates to election law, and because the questions that come to me are, can we do this? Can we take a position on this? Can we issue this statement? Can we have this speaker come to campus? Can we do this research project that touches on whatever political issue it might be? I try really hard not to discuss my political beliefs at work. So I vote, but I don't actually engage as much as some people might in the political process outside of that, because I don't want people to think, oh, Maya said that was okay because it's what she believes in, but she said that wasn't okay because she doesn't like the people who support that, that issue. So that's one thing that, can be a sort of a challenge. And of course, different people in my role could take different approaches to that, right? Not everyone has to do that. But I just think about, okay, if I went to a rally and I'm in, and I happen to be photographed at the rally, and then people say, aha, we knew all along that she believed X or that she didn't believe Y. So that's one thing. The other thing that I think is really difficult, and this goes back to Dr. Ejay's remarks about vaccinations becoming politicized, is so many things that seem originally on their face not to be political issues become political issues. And so it becomes very challenging to figure out how to approach those issues when the context is changing and evolving. And what we can do is one thing here and another thing over there. So, if I can go back to Prop 2 yet again to that but I mentioned that we had been involved in these Supreme Court cases where we were really active and vocal in defending diversity, right, and affirmative action. And everyone knew it. U of M was basically synonymous with diversity in admissions, right, and the desire for diversity in admissions. Then Proposal 2 is put forth, and we're suddenly subject to that Campaign Finance Act that I mentioned that says we can't use university resources to support or oppose ballot questions. So, like I said, that didn't mean we stopped believing in diversity, but it did mean we had to think differently about what we could say and how we could say it. And I will say, some people were saying we couldn't do any research, we couldn't mention Proposal 2. That's not what we did, but there were people who made that argument. We also sort of had, this was before my time, but one of our units put forth a white paper where they talked about the effects of Prop 209 in California and said, this is probably what would happen in Michigan too if Prop 2 were to pass. And somebody made them put a disclaimer on it that said, these views represent, these are only the views of this author and not the views of the, of the unit as a whole. And I thought, well, gee, that's not really what, I believe in disclaimers, don't get me wrong, lawyers love them. But I don't know that we needed to make one in that case because it was just presenting factual information. This is what happened in California. Now, some people might look at it and say, great, and some people might look at it and say, that's horrible. But either way, it's just information, and we as an institution are supposed to be engaging in research and scholarship and teaching and sharing information. So it troubled me a bit to think that we would disclaim responsibility, especially since, there were other reports that unit put out that may or may not have represented the views of the unit, and yet those reports didn't have a disclaimer, right? Just because they weren't politically charged in the same way that this particular report was. And so, we sort of had to navigate that, that issue. And the people who thought that Proposal 2 was bad didn't think the university said enough and wondered, why are you so tepid here? Like, why are you so lukewarm in your discussion of this proposal when you had been so staunch in your defense of affirmative action just a few weeks ago or months ago or, a year ago now? Why is it that you don't seem to be saying as much as you used to say? Maybe it wouldn't have passed if you had done more or said more. And the people who thought that we were who were in favor of the proposal were saying that we were violating the election law by saying anything about it at all. How could you have invited a speaker to campus? How did you put out that voter resource guide? You're clearly trying to influence the election in a way that you're not allowed to do. So it was really challenging to figure out, and it was, again, another example of a situation where the legal context, to the lawyers, we could make sense of it and say, okay, this is why we're here and this is why we're there. But to the general members of the university community, it was a much different experience, and it was really difficult to sort of translate that. And now, sort of going into time, that was at least clear enough that there was a proposal on the ballot. But you think about other things now where someone says, well, what about Black Lives Matter? Can we make a statement about Black Lives Matter? What if, does it make a difference that this candidate has come out against the Black Lives Matter movement? How does that all change and affect what we can and can't do?
Jump in there.
So I don't envy your job at all and having to try to figure some of that out, because I think about what I would say are sometimes little silly things that happen with me and the university on social media where when it's not an election season, usually like the School of Social Work or sometimes university accounts, if I say something that's relevant, they'll like or retweet it. But then, like, if it's depending on what's going on, that doesn't happen at all. And not all the stuff, like some of the stuff I say is political, so they shouldn't do that. But then one of the ones that I thought was just I had to go whatever, was in Black History Month, there was a unit that was going through and wanting to highlight Black faculty members. And then, so they had us write a little, and I was one of the people picked to be highlighted. So I wrote a little blurb. They went through and did it, and then they had to send me this thing about, but we can't tag you on social media like we are doing all the other faculty, because I'm like, okay, I get it, but that one seemed like a little.
That didn't go through my office. That wasn't me.
That one seemed a little silly, but I understand, like, the university, back to the disclaimer piece, we each individually would do what we need to do to behave appropriately, but the institution also behaves in their best interest and to protect themselves and to also be appropriate. So go blue and go blue.
And I'm hearing so much here, it's the interrelatedness of it all. And when we're students or when we're in a single unit, sometimes we don't always have to interact with. We're not forced to think about how many layers something goes through and how many different thought processes are being applied. And when you think about something, where Dr. Ejay started with the vaccine and how there's factual information, as Attorney Colversi was sharing. There's factual information there, and it's just what you think is factual information, and then it becomes a political issue. And now there are lawyers involved, and there are all these questions. And so, it brings us kind of to the next question around the real life ways in which these policy discussions and positions we take show up in our care and in our professional lives around health equity. And I'll kind of go back to you. I thought that was such a good example about starting off just with the vaccine trials before it was that issue.
So I'm going to go back to decades ago. So 26 years maybe, I just started practice, and I was taking care of a medical student, and she walked in, she just matched, and she found out she was pregnant. She came in to be checked. So I did the pregnancy test on her. And when I walked in the room, there are a couple things that I had to take with me. I had to take compassion into that room, I had to take respect, and I had to take zero judgment. Because I had no idea whether this was something she had planned, something that was going to disrupt her career. I didn't know what her perspective was on that. So I walked into the room and compassionately delivered the facts and waited for her response, and then provided her the tools she needed, again, to make an appropriate decision for her and her family. And I think in those moments, regardless of what side of the aisle that I stand on Norma McCorvey, otherwise known as Jane Roe, versus Henry Wade from Dallas District Attorney's Office, regardless of where I stand on either side, my job as a physician is to provide evidence-based tools for my patients to make the best decisions for them. And so that's where I stand on that.
And I think, you spoke about this in clinical care, but even now when students might come or when you're advocating outside of the university, how has health equity shown up for you?
So health equity has shown up in a big way because, prior to getting elected, I served on our county's Board of Health, and then after getting elected, I kept that as one of my committee assignments and then chaired it during the time when we first got vaccines. So a lot of my work right after getting elected was focused on how do we target the areas in the county where COVID hit the hardest, and then people that are least likely to engage with us to be able to get vaccinated. And like the story you brought up earlier about pastors and others that say, God has protected me, I don't need to get the vaccine. We had to work strategically to figure out how do we get trusted leaders in different communities to be able to help communities and residents feel comfortable, one, trusting the government, because many people don't trust the government, and I understand why, but also there's good government too. We try to be good government, but then there's also distrust of the vaccine once it got politicized. So that's a lot of the work that I've been focused on is that, and also we have the data on health inequities in the county, across the state, so working to prioritize shifting resources in a way where we can make that addressing those inequities a reality.
Just wanting to follow up, I developed a slide for some talk differentiating equality and equity in the concept of vaccines. And so one of the simplest ways to think about it is that equality, health equality, would be everyone gets free vaccine. It's free to everybody. But health equity is dealing with the horrendous inequities that have been done, the discussions that you have to have with underrepresented in medicine patients to get them to the point where they're comfortable. Maybe you have to bridge the gap in transportation to a drive-up site, et cetera, but equity is outcomes-based. Everyone getting vaccinated is health equity. Everyone getting free vaccine is health equality. We want health equity. We want the outcome to be folks are vaccinated.
I think that's a fantastic point, and something for anyone that's listening to the talk that wants to go into that kind of work to think about. It's hard work. It is so much harder to be that outcome driven and to come up with the creative strategies to do that. Initially, I think with the county's response to getting vaccines, I was largely focused on we'll do the mass vaccination clinics. That's not going to target the areas most in need, though. So then we ended up pivoting to pop-up vaccination clinics by partnering with community leaders that would want us to do it there, ranging from churches to township halls, all over. Doing our Nurse on the Run program, where for people that were homebound, getting a nurse right to their home to vaccinate them. And that helped us get towards the desired outcome as much quicker, but it's a challenge to be able to come up with a strategy while you're responding to a crisis, and getting people on board with that kind of change in strategy and service delivery.
I was just going to add, very briefly that the other thing that I think that this shows is that there is a need for the people who are making those decisions to be aware that those societal issues exist so that they can think about them when they're trying to address. It would be very easy to just say, well, we did a mass clinic. I don't know why you didn't come. It was your fault, right? Or this was enough. How could you not want to do it? Everyone knows you should do it. And so it's really important, I think, that we have people who are making the decisions who are informed and who are at least willing to, even if they didn't know it coming in, that they're at least willing to listen so that they can think about that situation and try to address it.
And I think from the standpoint of representation, that is it. I'll give you one really brief story. So I walked into a room, since I was new to Cincinnati just before the pandemic, I was meeting brand new patients, and I walked into this room, and this woman gasped and put her hand over her mouth as soon as I walked in the door, and I'm thinking, geez, Pete, what did I do? Well, she started crying, and she said this is the first time she's had a Black physician, and we hugged. In that moment, we knew that there were certain things that we had in common that we didn't have to expend energy explaining. And so when you talk about representation for the decision makers, there are certain things that would not pass the group as a whole if that individual was sitting there contributing to the discussion, because they're bringing a very unique perspective that's important in making solid decisions.
I just appreciate this so much. And I'm going to have to borrow that example, Dr. Ejay. I'm consistently trying to explain the difference between equity and equality. And I love the outcomes-driven perspective. And it is much more of a challenge. And even in this series of discussions that we're having, I think the easy piece is the excitement when we first realize we're passionate about an issue. And then the hard piece is traveling to the outcome. And a lot of what you've shared around Prop 2 and ballot initiatives, and we know that an election is coming up and we have constitutional amendments on the ballot again. There is so much to navigate, to review, to think about, to get to the end. And so before we get to the end and when there's a chance to be at the table, I'd love for you all to talk a little bit about the opportunities for advocacy that you've seen and that you've had the opportunity to take advantage of, or just to tell others you should consider this if you're interested. How can individuals be active, whether it's local, at a state level, on behalf of an institution, and if they're passionate about an issue? And I'll start with you, Professor Hodge.
So this is one of my favorite things to talk about. So first I would say a great way to be involved in policy, if it's not your main job, is to get appointed to local board or state commissions. So people that are watching right now at home or in here, think about what city you live in and make sure, because Michigan government can be complicated because we have townships and cities that share the same name. Figure out which one that you're in, go to the website and look for a part that says boards and commissions. Same thing for the county and at the state level. Those are all places for you to be actively engaged. So people tend to be most familiar with federal government where Congress people are on a bunch of different committees. That system is replicated at local levels of government too. The difference is that it's mostly residents that are on those advising the elected officials. So like I mentioned, I'm on Board of Health. I'm on there. There's one other commissioner, but everybody else that's on there is a resident and that has expertise in that subject area, and then they're there to advise us on policy. So that could be any of you. So when thinking about how do we make better health-related decisions, we need more people in healthcare that are involved in making policy. So that's one way to do it from a policy perspective. From a political perspective, campaigns end. We get through campaign season and that's it until the next round of campaigns. But getting involved with your political party of choice, because that is one way to be politically engaged all year round. So political parties are doing things like holding events and depending on the priorities of the people that make up the executive board for that. The way I got a lot of my political experience is I served on the executive board for the Washtenaw County Democratic Party for a number of years before deciding to run. And it's important to be in those kinds of leadership positions too, because it gets you in a position to shift what that organization is spending time on. There was a period of time where we still do it. We do canned food drives or other food drives and supply distribution, lots of different things you wouldn't necessarily think a political party might do. So you can shift that focus by being involved. So those are a couple of things.
I appreciate that. And do campaign seasons ever really end, Professor Hodge? It's another conversation.
So from my standpoint, I think, again, it's always important to figure out what you're going to stand on policy. on principle rather, what are you passionate about? So you have to spend a little time with yourself and figure that out, because once you become involved, people will continue to ask and you will continue to refine your expertise and so on and so forth. So you want to be heading in the right direction. Secondly, just even starting here at med school, advocating for all kinds of things as a student council president and being an advocate, that was one of the things that I really enjoyed. And I currently am on the Council of Medical Education, as I mentioned, for the AMA. What we're able to do in that situation, it's an elected position, there were 9 different organizations that endorsed me for that. One of the things we do is we assign folks in a nominating way 42 different medical institutions across the continuum of medical education. And for me, it's important, again, for representation to be able to put decision makers in the right spaces. And so for me, that's important. I also represent the Ohio State Medical Association as a delegate to the AMA, and I've been doing that for several decades. So knowing the issues, being able to go to bat, having protected time to do that. When I negotiate my contracts, because of the burnout factor as well, I negotiate that my work on behalf of my residents and fellows at the state, national, and local level are all part of what I do as my regular job. So when I go for 2 weeks to AMA, 1 week in June and 1 week in November, I bring that information back. I'm working on behalf of my institution, so that's not my vacation time. And just, again, being able to get support from my institution for those things has been amazing.
And I think that's such important advice as for students or young people in the healthcare professions to think about what you want to do and to push for it when you sit down at that table, because I don't know that we always think about that. Sometimes students want to offer or young professionals offer just to give up I'll just do it on my vacation or I'll use my personal time. But even knowing what the possibilities are to balance is really important. And I don't know, Maya, if you have anything to add.
Well, I'll just say this. I talked a lot about the limitations that apply to the university, and they do apply to individuals who are acting on behalf of the university, but students have a lot more flexibility. So students can engage very directly in the political process, in the campaign process. And so that's something that you definitely should, after you find your passion, that you definitely can pursue. But I also want to just say that even for faculty and staff who may be subject to these same limitations that apply to the university, there are still a lot of things that you can do. I think Professor Hodge is a perfect example of that, in that he is both a university faculty member and an elected official. So I guess what I would say is that and if you check out our FAQs on our website, there are sort of 3 buckets that things fall into. There are things that we can't do with university resources. There are things that we can do with university resources. And then there are things that each of us as individuals can do without using university resources. And so I think it's really important for us to recognize that those categories exist and to find the ways to, engage in those different categories.
Just one additional thing. Being a member of the Council on Medical Education has also been excellent, because when we had Dobbs v. Jackson come down on January 24th, revoking Roe v. Wade, what ended up happening was that we got the document from the ACGME OB Review Committee, which is the committee that writes the requirements for OB training. And we were to give our opinion on the changes to the requirements. So again, being in a position of advocacy for what is right, what a travesty it would be for a resident to have a patient in front of them, and that patient is about to succumb and they not be able to provide life-saving care within the scope of their practice. And so, yes, we have stated in the OB regulations that we will make sure that all the didactic care is comprehensive. So there's comprehensive family care that's taught to residents in OBGYN, and that they are able to educate patients on the full spectrum of abortion, and that they are able to go ahead and get their care outside of their training outside of a jurisdiction that may be legally apprehensive for them.
One quick thing. We've talked about engagement with governmental and political and professional organizations. I just want to put a plug in there, since I imagine most people watching work in Michigan Medicine. Michigan Medicine has a robust set of boards and committees for you to engage in internally. So when I worked for Michigan Medicine, I served on our social work committee, and then I was chair of our the Department of Psychiatry's DEI committee. So those are all over the place, and that might be a great way for all of you to get involved, to think about having an impact within your unit, or whatever, or the organization more broadly, depending on how high you are involved with it.
And I think that's such two great points to end on before we move to our question and answer. So if you are on our live stream, we are going to be taking questions from the live stream. So if you begin to start asking your questions, we'll be able to read them aloud. But I do think those last 2 points, getting engaged on campus. One thing in my former life, I was chief of staff of a school district, and people would always be like, I wish you had art or this or that thing, and we would have it. But if you didn't come to a board meeting, or you weren't engaged, or you weren't at the right place and listening actively, you may not know what is available. And at the same time, if you don't take the time to volunteer, maybe during the quiet times, or spend the time to get elected when things are quiet, when the big issues happen, it's sometimes too late. It's a different path, but if you're already at the seat at the table, when the big issue happens, you get to write the recommendations, and you're sitting there. So it's not, when we started planning these sessions, I thought, it's not just this moment. If this is the first time you've thought of health equity and health justice and what that looks like, welcome, because many of us have been fighting these issues from many different directions, and from vaccines to DEI and Prop 2 and how we admit to our schools and colleges here at the University of Michigan. It's a long road to progress and to justice, and so it's a constant engagement. It's a constant fight. And so we were first going to take, if there are any questions, I believe, do we have mics in the audience? It seems like we might. If there are any questions from the audience, we do have some folks here with us today, and we'd love to honor you all with the opportunity if you have any questions to ask. All right. Okay. I think we do have some questions coming over live stream, and so my colleague Nathan Henke in the back will ask us some questions.
So first question coming from Steve to the panel. Would love their thoughts and commentary on the notion of permanently adding and acknowledging an A for advocacy along with DEI as we as a university move into our second DEI strategic plan, or DEI 2.0, for the next 5 years.
So, I think that's a great idea, although I will just say another unit has already put in an A. They've put it in an A for accessibility, which I think is also an important thing to include. Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think many of our units are actually incorporating that point, even if they're not naming it as part of the official acronym.
I would agree. You saw I leaned over and looked at the lawyer to make sure I had it right. So it sounds like it's okay to do, and I would say push it as far as we can legally, right? I think the challenge would then become, can your unit coalesce behind a specific thing to advocate for or against those? So what does that look like? Not to say that'd be a challenge, not necessarily a barrier, but something to work through if that's an added thing that the units would start to do.
Just not specifically to the advocacy part, but you've heard of SMART goals that should be specific and measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. We have added I and E to that, so there's SMARTY goals for everything we do in GME, and so we've sort of changed that acronym. We'll try and squeeze an A in there too.
And I think even with what we're sharing today around adding the A, there's a way to empower around advocacy that is nonpartisan. And so even if we're not determining what our area of advocacy is, to the extent that it's possible, we can just be empowered to advocate and give lessons and opportunities around how advocacy operates and stand on the principles and core values of our institution and what we've already expressed. And there's always more letters. As someone who does this work, there's a J that folks want to add sometimes too for justice or
Yeah, Jedi.
Yeah,
So
okay.
JEDI.
Oh, I haven't seen it in that
DJ.
direction.
We do
I was-
DJ.
I'm a Star Wars fan, yes, ma'am.
I know. I was like, no, it's a Jedi. I think all of those things. It's about our practice too. Even if we don't change our acronyms, that is already what equity is about. If equity is focused on outcomes, which I loved that so much, we do not get to an outcome without advocating. We don't get to an outcome without actually changing our structures and our policies. So advocacy is already central to what we do.
Right. Oh, I don't know.
Can any of the speakers provide examples of where they've engaged in advocacy and found mutual understanding from folks with very opposite viewpoints? And if you could outline any strategies that those watching today could add to their practice.
I don't know that we can ask a follow-up to our live stream. We can see if we get an answer. So if you want to try a follow-up.
I want to try to follow up. So is the question saying you were advocating to someone who you knew had an opinion that was different from yours, but then turns out either you got them to come around or turns out they were on your team the whole time? While we wait for a response, I'll just keep talking about something else related. I would say that when you're engaged in advocacy, and I'm thinking from the policy perspective and trying to get elected officials to come around to a particular idea, you're not always going to have, I think, the same enemies every time. So you might be able to find compromise on different issues that are unrelated to help everybody get to the potential win that they're looking for. I can answer better if I get that follow-up.
So one of the things that I think, getting an email from a colleague who was in clinic, this was early on in my advocacy for vaccine hesitant folks, I got an email from a colleague and she said, this woman who had absolutely refused to get the vaccine came back and talked about mRNA vaccine technology that she'd heard about on a Facebook Live that Dr. Edgy did. And she explained in full detail. So I think from that standpoint, she was now going to go ahead and get vaccinated and get her family vaccinated. Again, putting the facts out there and translating it into digestible nuggets that patients can understand was one way we got her from absolutely no way to I'm having my family vaccinated as well.
And I will just take this opportunity for a shameless plug. Join us October 17th for Navigating Polarity, our next session, which is wholly dedicated to what it is like to navigate these difficult conversations and to find the outcomes. But Nathan, do we have another question, or did our live streamer follow up?
We do, and for the panelists, there is a 20-second delay, so our live exchange is going to be a bit delayed, and so someone had added in comment, A, for anti-racist, as Michigan Medicine has declared this a priority, was something that they offered in, and then Nicole, who offered us the question, followed up with confirming that someone who had different views and you were able to find a compromise in moving forward.
I think Dr. Ajay did give a great answer of doing that. And I also think the approach that she shared where the person found the information and was wanting to learn more, and it was the facts that were shared, is often different than an argument, which it can be very difficult. And I often say I sit in a privileged seat here. They pay me to talk to people in a nice voice. So it's my job to tell you about equity, to tell you about anti-racism in a nice voice, and that everyone is not paid to do that. And I understand that that's work and that it's not for everyone.
I think there's something to be said for relationships. I think advocacy, relationships are foundational, and you want to think about the fact that that person is much more likely to respect what you're saying if you have an existing relationship. And so as a family doc, honestly, that's one of the greatest things that I love about my job. I can come back to that well. They can come back and talk to me. They know that I've got a history with them, usually for decades, and that they know that I wouldn't harm them in any intentional way whatsoever, and only wish the best for them.
This relationship is huge. Did you want to follow up with that clarity?
Well, I was just going to say that I think the relationship piece and then the other example about the way you get the information out. So thinking about from the equity-focused piece, you could get vaccines out a certain way. If that's not getting the outcome you want, you need to do it differently. Same way with information, because in addition to getting information out, we have to combat mis and disinformation, the relationship piece about why partner with trusted community leaders. Well, part of that is because of the relationship. That's what's going to get people to change their minds. I mean, the studies in this show that people are most likely to listen to someone that they have a relationship with. So you just trying to lecture at them or say, get the vaccine is going to save your life, it's not going to necessarily work. Now, if a friend or family member gets it and then they say it, that's totally different. So it's the relationship, I think, and then also the way you get the information out. Because you said that you did a town hall, right? Or you did like a live stream?
We did 39 every 2 weeks. So people could come back and say, and they came back. So we moved.
That's a different way to get the information out compared to flyers or signs on buses. That more personal touch probably did the trick.
All right. And so it looks like, thank you so much to our panel for answering all of our questions. We are actually right at our time for our closing, and we're going to invite our Associate Vice President and Associate Dean for Health, Equity, and Inclusion, Dr. David Brown, to come and give us some kind of closing thoughts and closing words.
Yes, thank you so much. What a wonderful panel we had here this morning to afternoon. Good afternoon. For those who don't know me, I'm David Brown, and I have the honor to serve as the Associate President and Associate Dean for Health, Equity, and Inclusion here at Michigan Medicine. I want to thank each of our panelists, Dr. Luigi, Commissioner and Professor Justin Hodge, and Associate General Counsel Maya Kobersi for participating and sharing. I learned a ton from you, and you've inspired me, and I'm sure others who are already doing this work to even do more. Some of the highlights that I wanted to bring up is I love the tripod. There were so many pearls dropped today. If you weren't here at the beginning, the tripod of physician advocacy to promote changes that ameliorate suffering, to stand by our rock on our journey, to understand what our passions are, to do the work that is meaningful to us so that can nourish us, because we all know we're working hard and we need to decrease our risk for burnout. How we can all get involved. I'm also appreciative that each of them have different professional backgrounds, yet they're advocating for some similar things. So we can all get involved in advocacy, no matter what our background is, our profession is, and seek opportunities for service in commissions and boards. Part of our diversity is intergenerational, and I also love how Dr. Edgy talked about having a mentor under 30. I get 78 mentors under 30 every year. 170 medical student mentors under 30 and many residents, and really proud of our learners because they are some of our biggest advocates, and they are the teachers in this space. And so at Michigan Medicine, we think of all of us as learners, and so we also need to think of all of us as teachers. And so I'm appreciative of all of our learners as teachers. I'm also greatly appreciative of our panelists and their innovation and bringing in advocacy into their teachings. And I'm appreciative of them overcoming barriers. I've contacted Maya Kobersi numerous times, and I actually brought some students who want to do some advocacy work, and how can they do this and how can it be legal? And the great thing I love about Maya and OGC is they help us figure out a path forward that is legal, if it's possible. Not everything's possible, but don't think that things are impossible. Bring the impossible, and she can let you know if it can be possible. Also want to thank the audience for participating. It was great to see some people here in the audience and to have some people online give us some really probing questions that I'm appreciative of the answers of our panelists. The Office for Health, Equity, and Inclusion, or OHE, is proud to be a sponsor of these community conversations to engage our faculty, staff, and learners about dialogues about polarizing and sensitive topics. And we want to thoughtfully demonstrate how we are valuing our institutional values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging, advocacy, anti-racism, ableism, all of those things. So there are a lot of letters, and we stand for all of them. I want you to join us for our next community conversations in a series. The next one is, as Kristen Howard mentioned Navigating Polarity, which is Monday, October 17th at 6:30 p.m. Then we will have another one on November 3rd at 6:30. This will be a Zoom seminar on the age of social media, personal beliefs, and the professional persona. And our final one would be on Friday, November 18th at noon. And this one would be a webinar on the post-election review, reproductive rights, and justice. One of the individuals asked this question that was addressed by the panel, and one of the things we're trying to do is to bring more people into our diversity work, and through that is to bridge across difference. And one of the things I learned in my reading and studying is that in order to, one of the key principles of bridging across difference is to want to listen and understand the facts from others as much as we want to persuade. And so in order to be change agents, we have to be able to hear as much as to speak. And so if that bi-directional exchange exists, we can potentially make progress. I hope to see you all virtually or in person at our future community conversations as we learn to grow towards building a community where we all feel valued and can thrive through social justice, advocacy, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you.